about the campaign, some interesting facts, and then we thought we'd open the floor for some questions towards the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to act like the interviewee for you, Claire. Okay, the interviewer. Sorry, you're the interviewee. And ask you some questions. Okay, so are you ready?
Okay, I can just see. Oh, that's quite spooky. That's like when you see like people are doing lives and the numbers are going up. I can see the number of participants just going up as we're talking.
I'm just really glad that anybody's watching this, because I thought that nobody would turn up. So that's good. It's good that some people are here. Hello, people.
Hello.
So Claire, can you tell us how it was that you first came up with this idea about campaigning for the Witches of Scotland?
Okay, well, so my background is as a lawyer, and I specialise in criminal miscarriage of justice cases. So I specialise working in the appeal court, challenging people who have been convicted of crimes and seeing whether or not we can overturn their conviction. So that's kind of the day job. And I've always been interested in Scottish history. I lived and worked in the old town pretty much full time, and I absolutely loved wandering about the old town with my wee dogs when we went out for walks. And I was aware of the history of people who were tried and convicted of witchcraft in Scotland, and I kind of knew about it from an academic angle, really. I'd looked at the witch trials in respect of whether or not women could be witnesses on their own right, how trials were conducted, and I'd sort of thought about it in a pretty much an academic way, a legal way, but it was a culmination of my interest in law, in history, and I suppose as a feminist, when all these things came together. And I was reading a book that I highly recommend, and obviously we've spoken about this book a lot, Zoe. Just before I decided on the campaign, I'd recently read a book called Where Are the Women by Sarah Sheridan, and it's a book that reimagines Scotland as a place where all the places are celebrated as being named after women. And so instead of all the statues being to men, they were to women. The street names are women. She occasionally does a museum of misogyny. She puts that up where people can learn about those sorts of things. And I read the book, dipped in and out of it, and really, really loved it. And I'd read that quite recently, and I was one day walking about Princes Street Gardens, and taking my two wee dogs with me, and I must have been in a particular mood because I was stomping around it, reflecting on Sarah's book and thinking, where are the women? There are statues to men, there are statues of war, there are statues of a dog. There's there's the unfortunately named Bum the dog.
Nice.
Yeah, nice. He was given to us by Canada as their Greyfriars Bobby. So he's a named dog. And I got up to the top of Princes Street Gardens, and there's a life-size statue of a bear who did really, really good things during the war. And he's called Wojciech the bear. And I thought, this is ridiculous. There's a statue of a bear, there's a statue of a dog, there's statues of numerous men, there's the naming of numerous men, but there are no women. There are literally no women named here. And I thought about that, and I thought about Sarah's book, and I thought, not only are there no women named here, but I looked over to Norloch, where it was said that women were drowned as witches. There were actually very few, if any, witch drownings there. That wasn't what happened to them. But just up above the Norloch at the Castle Esplanade that I could see was a site where many women were burned and strangled. And I thought, not only are we not recording the great things that women do throughout history, we're not properly looking at that, but we're also not recording the terrible things that were done to women. So just at that one moment, all those sort of things fused together, and I came home and I drafted the sort of Witches of Scotland manifesto. And very shortly after that time, I met Zoe. No, did I? Yeah, I met Zoe, and after that time. And Zoe, what did I ask you?
Well, I think we've sort of bonded over a chat about how much we love podcasts, and in particular true crime podcasts. And Claire said I'd had an idea that I wanted to do a podcast before that because I'm quite chatty, and I think podcasts are a natural, like the boom in them recently has just been brilliant because it just means that anybody can record stuff about stuff they're passionate about. I really like the democratic nature of it, and I really wanted to do a podcast, but really didn't have a clue about what to do it about, and didn't think anybody would be interested, particularly in me just rambling. So Claire and I met. You said to me, didn't you? Oh, you had this idea, and did I want to do a podcast with you? And I kind of thought, yeah, I like her. She's nice, and we've got some similar, ideas. So, so that it just kind of went from there. And that must have been it was just before our friend Mel's wedding. Well, she married Drew also, but that was in like August of 2019.
Yeah,
must have been. And then so we talked about that then, and then I didn't hear anything else for a little while. Like maybe a few months, and then you got back in touch.
Yeah, I was I think beavering away would put it too high, but I'd worked on making a website to tell folk about it and getting our name together and researching, and I thought it would be a good idea, given the sort of feminist nature of it, to call it the Witches of Scotland campaign, and to have it start on International Women's Day 2020.
So that was quite an auspicious day, wasn't it? Because we launched, and then immediately, with a stunning lack of supernatural foresight.
Absolutely. With a sudden lack of that, we were like, hey, we've got a campaign, and then 2 weeks later everyone was locked down in their house for the first lockdown.
Yeah, but actually it's worked out brilliantly, because we had our initial plan. Well, your initial plan, Claire, was I think to do between maybe 6 and 10 episodes.
6.
And we're now on episode, I don't know, last week did we release 34, 33?
We've just finished 33, and we've got a couple more in the bag, and we've got about 15 more people that we've got lined up, and it just keeps growing. The list of people just keeps adding.
Yeah, it's fantastic, because if it hadn't been for the lockdown, we wouldn't have made as many episodes. But I think also we just wouldn't have been able to speak to the huge amount of actually international and people all over Britain giving us different bits of information with their expertise. And so it's been amazing, because it means that all during lockdown, we've talked to people in, I don't know, where have we talked to? Salem, Massachusetts, to Iceland, Denmark,
Nigeria.
Yep.
The Denmark show's the next one, I think, or the one after, perhaps. We've still got to go.
Yeah. So people all over the place, where different countries had different experiences with their own witch trials, because Scotland, unfortunately, is one of the most accomplished at accusing and murdering people for being witches. So it was quite interesting to compare Scotland with these other areas, but also then having lots of guests from all over Scotland as well, giving us their insights into things, which has been fantastic. Could you maybe outline, Claire, what the campaign aims are, if people don't realise what they are?
The campaign aims are threefold. The first is to obtain a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft under the Witchcraft Act of 1563. The second is to obtain an apology for those that weren't convicted but were still affected by it. And that would include, for example, people who had been accused of witchcraft but had died whilst waiting to come to trial, had been accused of witchcraft, had been tortured, but for some reason perhaps been acquitted, but their lives were still blighted with the accusation. So not to miss out those. So a pardon for those convicted, an apology for all those accused, and the third thing is to obtain a national monument. And certainly there has been talk of a national monument right back. I think 2008 was the first time I read about people suggesting that there should be a national monument. But it seems that although a national monument is discussed, it has kind of run out of steam before. And I thought it was a good idea to try and put the idea of asking for a pardon along with these other aims, because it's not only important that I think that we ask for a pardon for those people who suffered this most terrible miscarriage of justice, but also that we memorialise it in some way. And I think it's something that is important that the state should pay for. So 3 things: pardon, apology, national memorial.
And with regards to memorials, there are, I mean, anybody that has an interest in the Witches Scotland knows a wee bit about it already. There are memorials scattered across Scotland, but they range from being just a very local thing that's been put together, or unofficial ones where you wouldn't know necessarily that's what the memorial is there for, through to ones that people have raised money for. But there isn't a national memorial, is there?
No, I mean, it shows you the strength of feeling and interest in it, that all around Scotland, where there have been women and men, the split is approximately 85% women in Scotland, 15% men, lower than the European average, which is about 20% men, 80% women, or lower or higher, depending on which way you look at it, if you're a man or a woman. And those are all memorials that people have sort of raised money for themselves or paid for themselves. There's a beautiful memorial that a couple put up in Forfar. There are a beautiful memorial in Orkney. There's a memorial in Prestonpans. There's a memorial in Curis. In fact, three plaques from Curis to Torryburn. So there are places all over Scotland where people have already done these things. But I think the most important thing for me for a national memorial is that the state decides to pay for it, and it comes out of the state pocket, and the state keep it and look after it. And I know that we've been talking about what's the best way to memorialise as we've gone along in our campaign, and there's been various different ideas about how to do that, aren't there, Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, there's different sort of interpretations or approaches in different countries for their own which ones. There's some really amazing ones. There's going, like in Salem, they're chairs, aren't they? In Salem, they're like sort of outside outdoor chair, like is it benches or yeah, it's benches.
It's like concrete benches that go all the way around a beautiful square. Because of course in Massachusetts there were 19 people killed as witches, and in Scotland there were 2,500, and that's a very that's an estimate, but it's a very
conservative. Yeah, so I mean, there's so ranging from that, which are quite practical ones. I like the idea of that one as well, though. To other ones, there's one where the artist Louise Bourgeois was involved with that one, which I think would be really amazing. When we interviewed Sarah Sheridan, she had a really great idea for a memorial that would be like a sensory one, basically, where there would be smells and light and things like that, which was really interesting.
Yeah, the smells of the smells that women who were accused of witchcraft would have smelt at the time. So particular seeds and stuff and flowers that were common at that time would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So I think that, I mean, this isn't a situation where we've gone, right, we're gonna commission an artist or we're gonna design it ourselves or anything like that. Really, we are pushing so that the state does it. And we would be really interested in being on like a steering committee or something. And we would definitely be there when it was unveiled. But we are not suggesting that we really have anything much to do with the making of the memorial, the choosing of the artist or whatever. But I'd certainly think it's really important because as we've discussed on the podcast on numerous occasions, with what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, with representation of the importance of statuary for people in their own country to be able to see their past and their history and to come to terms with it, we think it's really very important that there is a statue to it so that Scots themselves can see it and know about it, and that visitors to Scotland can also see it and know about it, and that we recognise that as being something that's part of our past, that's an uncomfortable fact, but it's a fact. So we need to be really upfront about it, which leads me on to ask you this, Claire. Yeah. Sometimes we get the odd person, I'm going to say man, who says to us, why are you looking for a pardon and apology? It happened hundreds of years ago. They're dead. Get over it. Why? What is the point of it? What is the point of asking for these things?
Okay, well, I've got a lot of answers to that, probably much more than would take up an hour. Some of them with expletives, but let's try and keep it short. and expletive free. The first thing is that well, there's no time limit in justice. We've said this before, Zoe, that a terrible injustice was done to people. Now, many countries, they've already acknowledged that and moved on. In Salem, Massachusetts, the cornerstone of learning when you're a law student basically starts with the Salem witch trials to show how badly wrong things can go if there isn't a proper process and procedure put in place. And as I said, Salem had 19 people executed. We had approximately 2,500, but many, many more in Scotland were accused, probably about 4,000 people. And again, conservative estimate, but all those people that were accused would have had their lives ruined. The 2,500 that would have been killed never went on to have people who would have been families in Scotland. We have lost all those people. We have lost the connections with those people, and that's a loss to Scotland. And at the time these things happened, there were only 1,000,000 people in Scotland, so 4,000 out of 1,000,000 was a large amount. So I think that these people deserve justice. They died, they were strangled, they were burned, and they were named witches. And that's why we call ourselves the Witches of Scotland, because we don't shy away from the fact that that's what they were convicted of. That's how they remain. Justice demands, in my view, that it is addressed that those people were not witches, those women and men killed, and in fact that justice prevails, and what we do is we obtain a posthumous pardon for them and take the name of those people back from witches to the women and men that they were. Now, posthumous pardons are not that uncommon. It has happened before. Even in Scotland, posthumous pardons were granted to all the men who were convicted of homosexual offences. The pardon was made clear that that was both for the living and the dead. The Scottish Parliament's currently debating whether or not to grant a pardon to those people convicted in civil unrest or criminal unrest in the miners' strike, and it's again collective and posthumous. It's for all those people that were convicted, whether living or dead. So I suppose the first thing is justice. The second reason I can think of, importantly, is that witchcraft is still used as a tool of persecution around the world at the moment. And
yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because one of our guests spoke to us about the campaign that he's involved with. So I think this is a good opportunity for us as well to tell you about what he does, so that if this is something that you're interested in, that you get on board with what he's involved with as well. So Claire, who was that guest?
That was Leo Igwe. He he's a humanist. He's won numerous international awards. He's been the subject of HBO documentaries. He's been the subject of BBC. I think BBC also did a documentary on him. And basically what he does as a full-time job is run advocacy for alleged witches. And it's throughout his continent, the continent of Africa, that he works. And he works trying to highlight modern day cases where people are accused of witchcraft. And unfortunately, as we have seen throughout every witchcraft accusation, be it Denmark, be it Iceland, be it anywhere in Europe, it is vulnerable people that are targeted as witches. And
yeah.
That's something. No, that's something I think you've spoken about before, is the inherent strangeness of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we have seen time and again historically with the stories of people that were accused and convicted in Scotland, but it's something that's still ongoing now, as you're saying, Claire. So it might be, we've got this kind of narrative going on that the women of Scotland that were killed as being witches were healers or redheads or, fierce and feisty or left-handed or whatever. And there may have been women that fell into those categories, but the one thing that unites really all the women and the men that were accused, or nearly all of them, was that they were in a position of vulnerability in some way. So they might have been unusual. They might have been suffering from some form of senility. They might have had some sort of physical disability or difference. They might have been poor. They might have annoyed somebody and it could be retribution for them. They could just be a bit strange and a bit apart from the community. Or, as we found in quite a few cases, somebody wanted their money and or their land. Like we've heard of cases where it was the son-in-law that made the accusation, and then lo and behold, the son-in-law then gets the mother-in-law's, farm or whatever. So it's not dissimilar to what is happening now with what Leo Igwe is doing, which is where it's people that are vulnerable in some way. And unfortunately, one of the cases that he talked about when he came on the podcast was about a wee girl in Africa just now. Which country was it, Claire?
She spoke Liberian.
I should have written that down before I came on. But the wee girl's only 6, and she's been accused in her school by some of her schoolmates that she's a witch. And the school's response to that wasn't, "Don't be ridiculous." The school's response to it was like an exclusion straight away. So she was chucked out of the school, and her family, I think it's her grandmother, is fighting with Leo to get her back into education, because Leo has said that that if once the child leaves education, it's very hard to get them back into education again, and that they need that education in order to make something of their lives. It's a huge issue for them if they leave education. And apparently in the places where he's working with different organizations, it's things like, somebody's maybe fallen out with their friends, like it is in the case with this little girl, or it's that somebody has, there's been illness and they're looking for somebody to blame for it. And I think there's been a rise, I think this is right, isn't it, Claire, during the sort of the spread of COVID, where people were getting accused for, you're a witch and you caused this to happen, and people are finding a scapegoat essentially. So it's not something that's done and dusted. It's still a really current issue, and we think it's really important in Scotland that we say, right, well, we recognise that, we recognise our own past history, and we say that this is wrong. It's not a thing. Like you can't convict somebody of being a witch. Yeah. So that's why it's still really current and important to us.
Absolutely. I mean, Leo, when we spoke with Leo, he said, you've no idea how important your campaign is to me, because I want to be able to take your campaign and to show it to people, to say, please believe me, the people being accused just now are the same as these people who were accused back in Scotland, and they weren't guilty of witchcraft, and neither are the people who are being accused now. So he thinks that any efforts to be able to assist in that regard will be some help to him. And he gave us that example of the young girl called Catherine Karma excluded from school. But sadly, there are so many others, so many serious and horrific, I won't go into the details, but serious and horrific allegations being made about witchcraft and terrible things happening to people as a result of them.
And there are some other places that are looking at historic issues about witchcraft in a similar way to we are. And one of those places is Catalonia. Isn't that right, Claire?
Yes, we were contacted before International Women's Day this year, about 2 weeks beforehand, and we were both really, really chuffed, because a sort of, what was it, cultural and historical. So apparently it's the cultural and historical magazine in Catalonia. Sapiens had contacted us to say that they had seen our campaign and they were very impressed by it, and they started a campaign, Witches of Catalonia, and they are wanting a pardon for the women of Catalonia who are convicted as witches. Again, much fewer than in Scotland. They had a very, very snazzy opening day event. They also chose to open on International Women's Day. I think it's fair to say they had a slightly larger budget than us, Zoe, would that?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we, just to make it clear, we don't have any budget whatsoever. We've nothing. Claire has paid for the podcast and things like that. We sell merchandise now. So our merchandise is like mugs and t-shirts, things like that. And that's not for us. That's because Claire's brother very kindly agreed to do the sound engineering on our podcast right at the beginning. And Claire has said to him, it'll just be 6 to 10 episodes. And now he spends hours on it every week and has done for the last 34 weeks. So we don't have any money to pay him. So whenever we sell anything on merchandise, it goes to David, Claire's brother.
Yeah.
So this isn't like a kind of a money-making thing for us. This is very much a passion project, as they say.
Absolutely. And no doubt it's a passion project for those, for those in Catalonia as well, but they had a big budget, and we see lots of women in squares in Catalonia, as they must have some like drone footage as things as drones fly into them and they say women not witches, because our hashtag has been women not witches when we're going, and they've picked it up as well. They decided to have a petition like ours, but their reach was slightly greater than theirs, and they got 150 professors of history to sign their petition to kick off.
Yeah.
I think their petition is currently sitting at about 10,000 people, and their magazine, they sold out of their magazine and had to do a reprint of it. So the normal amount of magazines that they usually bought, they usually printed, weren't enough, and they sold out. And they also had us on their International Women's Day event, where Zoe and I's faces were beamed onto a live event outside in Barcelona, which was
Barcelona.
I know. I'm so hoping it wasn't HD. Saw us, but they are. We really hope to go over to Barcelona to see what they're doing as well. But they had an amazing outpouring of interest in it, as I say. 10,000 people in a very, very short period of time. So it was great to see, and we really hope to go over to Barcelona to see what they're doing as well.
So you mentioned there that about the Catalonian petition. People might be interested to know how it is that we are going about to campaign for the 3 things that we're asking for. So I mean, obviously we've got the podcast that is an educational tool, basically, and to get people involved and to tell them about what the stories were. Because one thing actually that you and I've talked about a lot is that really before starting this project, we didn't really know very much at all really about the witches of Scotland, and that we, despite growing up here, you were born here, I moved here when I was 5, hadn't been taught about it, didn't know anything about it, knew that there had been witches, had a sort of a notion that women had been ducked in water or that they'd been burnt at the stake, but that's really all I thought about it, because it's become a kind of a detached, not real story. And I think that's something we both felt really strongly about, isn't it, is humanizing the people.
Absolutely. At the start of every podcast, we try and name groups of people that were convicted as witches, and we try to give you as much story about them. So some stories, as we've come across very, very sadly, just say, I think particular one that we came across, Zoe, just said a date, and then it said sundry witches were executed in Scotland and the locus of the place. It didn't even tell you the amount, just sundry witches. But some people we have a lot of information on them. And I should say, the book that if people are wanting to look at the names of the people killed, there's a number of ways they can do it. They can go online and look at if you put in just database witches Scotland, it will come up. And that will bring up the survey of Scottish witchcraft online. And it will also bring up the interactive witch map, where you can look at the map, zero in, and get information of it. But the book which started it off for me, I suppose, was Larner Lee and McLachlan, and that's the source book of Scottish witchcraft, which was I think it was a 2005 reprint of a 1971 book, and it brought together for the first time, but it was in fact the second time, as many names of people killed as witches as possible. And the first time, in fact, had been no less than the librarian of the New York Library in 1938. He was a Scotsman who decided to gather together the names of the people killed as witches in Scotland and as much information as he could. And from the 1930s to the 1970s, it lay dormant. And then the book by Larner, Lee and McLachlan was used, and that's still in print now. You can buy copies of that online. I bought it. Mine is well thumbed, and please cover your ears if you don't like this sort of thing, but I write on these sorts of books, so to remind me. Oh, sorry, Zoe, sorry. Do you see that teacher's shake of the
I know.
Do you see
not
that?
Not really. That's terrible. It's good that you use the book and that it's a living document, basically, that it's something that we go back to, that you go back to so thoroughly, because each time we do a podcast, we name different witches, so that it's not just sundry witches and a date. It's, whatever information we can actually find, and sometimes it's quite a lot, and sometimes it's very, very scant. So we do like to use that. It's really important, and we've got lots of information about this on our website as well, which is witchesofscotland.com, and we're on Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that. So we post links to things that we mention in the podcasts. But it is definitely she's going to toot her own horn here. It is definitely worth going back and listening to the podcasts. Not necessarily for us, although that's quite fun, but the experts really know what they're talking about. So we've got lots of really brilliant experts, ranging from, we've got an archaeologist, lots of different stripes of historian, we've got lots of writers, artists, because what was that, Claire?
We've got modern day witches.
Modern day witches, yeah, we do. There's a huge body of interesting resource out there in the form of the humans that have engaged with it in different ways. So it's really, really interesting, and I think that's what's quite nice about for us doing the podcast, is that we are not in any way suggesting that we're experts. We're not in any way suggesting that we started this, that that we are in charge of it or anything like that. It's just something that Claire was really interested in, and then when she told me about it, I got really interested in it, mostly from the point of view of thinking, like, why don't I know about this? We should all know about this in Scotland, because it was so widespread. And it's lovely because each week we get a different expert on who tells us about their area of study or interest, and we learn about it at the same time as the listeners learn about it. And I really like that. I think it's good. Staving off.
Yeah, it also usually means that we're asking the same questions that we would ask if we were listeners, because it's not pre-prepared, it's not pre-planned. And yeah, I remember, I don't know if this was before we started recording or not, but I remember I was speaking to Rachel Christ, who is the curator of the Salem Witch Museum, and she said she had Scottish people coming over, speaking to her and saying, oh, we're really, really interested, wow, history of witchcraft. And she was saying, do you not know your own history? You're coming to Salem to see about the witches of Salem and hear about the people that this happened to. It's your country that has that. And one of the things we talked about in terms of memorialization might not only be a statue or something of lights, but we've also talked about another way of memorializing the witches, Zoe.
Yeah, which I would personally be really, really keen for, which would be a museum, and there's people, representatives from 2 different cities at this point have got in touch with us to say that they're really interested in doing that. We can't talk about that just now, it's quite exciting. But we think that would be really great, because, I'm a teacher and education's everything. And I just think it's so important that people know about it. And also that some of the myths that surround it are challenged a wee bit, and that people have sort of the true facts as far as we can get. I just think it's really interesting.
Yeah, the thing is that we're being challenged on our misunderstandings as well about witchcraft as we go along, our views. And one of the things I think that we started off with asking people, and we got an overwhelming response. Was it yourself that tweeted, Zoe?
I can't remember, because it feels like it was about 25 years ago, but it must have been in the autumn. We asked, one of the 2 of us anyway, asked if it was that way now and there was accusations of witchcraft now in Scotland, do you think that you'd be accused? And it was actually a really overwhelming response. And while the more the more we talk to historians, the more we realise, obviously, that it wasn't just red-headed, left-handed ladies, but that, you know, it was all sorts of women and some men too, obviously. But it still really strikes a chord, because I think that the thing that really people are chiming with is that we don't have parity, we don't have equality, and that the oppressed in society are still treated poorly, and that this is still a really current issue, and it's a particularly strong issue for feminists, because we can see that the majority in Scotland were women, and that nobody stuck up for them. And once you were accused, there was no way back. There was no, you didn't have a lawyer, you didn't have, you know, you'd never be sticking up for you. That was it. Somebody could just go, she's a witch. And it was like, honestly, that straightforward, which is just completely bonkers. So I think, Claire, with your legal background, I think that's of real interest to you, isn't it?
It is,
Like
yes.
the sort of the lack of the process.
As usual in the podcast, so you start asking one question and we get completely on to another, because you asked me about,
can't help it.
You asked me about how we're doing it, how we're doing.
Oh yes, very good, very good.
Completely forgot to mention we'll
get there eventually.
The whole thing that we've done is I drafted a petition, a public petition, to the petitions department at Scottish Parliament. And I drafted a petition asking for the three things: the pardon, the apology, and the national memorial. So that was an open document which people were allowed to sign. And I think about 3,500, was it, give or take, people signed it.
Yeah, I mean, we initially just hoped we'd get up to about 1,000. Yeah, and then as it crept up, I wanted us to get kind of symbolically to at least as many as we know were executed, and we surpassed that, which I think, I know it's not really logical, but I think symbolically, I think that was good, that many people, at least in Scotland, were behind it, and the support's been really positive, hasn't it? There's been a huge amount of support.
It's been overwhelming, and what happened was, after we had those signatures, so the signatures are public for 6 weeks. That period of time has closed. But what happens now is that it goes to the Justice Committee, and the Justice Committee consider it, and they consider sending it out to other bodies, and it can take quite a lot of time of people looking at it. For example, it might go to history and culture, it might go to justice, so it might go out to different bodies, and they will consider it. But when the petition ended, the Scottish Government wrote a document which sets out their position, which I was really interested in, because I wanted to know whether or not they would be very much against it, because I know there was a previous petition which wasn't actually a competent petition, in the sense it was asking for a pardon for Janet Horne, who was a Scotswoman who was convicted, the last woman to be convicted of witchcraft under the English Act. Oh no, did I say Janet Horne?
Not Janet Horne. Not Janet, because you're thinking
Janet
about
Horne,
her.
the last woman to be convicted of witchcraft in Scotland.
Helen Duncan, wasn't it?
Correct, it's Helen Duncan. And Helen Duncan, so that petition was about, I think, getting Helen Duncan a pardon, the last woman convicted of witchcraft in England, although she was a Scotswoman. Therefore, the Scottish Parliament wouldn't be able to help with that. And in any event, hers was more really about whether or not she'd been guilty of, I suppose, colluding with the enemy was the idea, because it was said that she had information about a ship going down that she shouldn't have had. And the question is whether or not that was information obtained through means of witchcraft or otherwise, and they prosecuted her as a witch. And
she was a medium, so she was a medium who'd been shown to use kind of the tricks of a performative medium, shall we say, where she was known. There's photographs, they're really interesting if you Google her, and you'll find them, but of her pulling like cheesecloth out of her mouth, and of producing sort of ephemera and things like that. So it's a very, very different thing altogether to the people that we're talking about from during the Satanic Panic periods.
Yes. So I was obviously aware that petition hadn't been successful before, although quite frankly I wasn't very surprised that it hadn't been successful, and I wanted to know what the government said this time, and we were quite blown away by the response that the government gave, because what they accepted was, well, they acknowledged for the first time ever publicly the Scottish government acknowledged the injustice and the wrong done to women and men convicted of witchcraft. They acknowledged, and to me, that's the first time that has ever happened in hundreds of years. And I was actually quite emotional when I saw it in print that there was that response. And the second thing was, particularly importantly from the sort of legal aspect, they said, yes, there is precedent for a posthumous and collective pardon, and made reference to the Homosexual Offences Act that I had referenced in the petition. So basically they accepted the two premises: one, that there was a terrible injustice done to these people, and two, there was precedent for it. So I thought that was really, really positive. What happens now, of course, is we just wait to see what the committees do with it, and that's where we're at there. And as you've said in the background, we're talking to lots of politicians, albeit at the moment they're more interested at the moment in things coming up in a week or so, Zoe.
Can't think why. I don't know what's so important, but okay. But so we're still very focused on the campaign, but needfully we've got to wait until things have settled down and the new parliament's been picked and so on, and that'll all get reorganized. So hopefully in time we'll come back to that one. Now we've got a few questions, Claire. So shall we take the questions? Yeah. Now Carolyn is just organising this here. So we've got one question. Somebody asked, why did we think that Scotland was so bad? Like, why was Scotland so harsh?
Well, we've got various theories about that, don't we, Zoe? But one of our experts, so one of the early podcasts, we do 3 podcasts with him in a row because he gave us so much information, was Julian Goodyear. Julian Goodyear has written a lot of books on witchcraft. One of the best, I think, is the European Witch Trials, which is a hefty tome, but very interesting. I've dipped in and dipped out of many chapters of that. And Julian explained to us that it was a combination of lots of factors. And he said it was a combination, and this is dumbing down what was basically his thesis and all sorts of work done, but it was the combination of the religious fervour built up because there were religious tensions at the time. So the Reformation and the church at the time. The second was access to courts. There were a lot of local courts that people could access, so people could go about vindicating their rights, first of all through the kirk itself and through there, and then the kirk referencing the cases onto the church. So good access to local courts, the Reformation, and the third thing, and referencing another book, the third thing was King James the Sixth of Scotland and First of England. He was God's envoy on earth, as it was understood. The king was descendant; he had the divine right as king. He was the God's person on earth.
Guy on earth. Mm-hmm.
The guy on the ground, and he very strongly believed in witchcraft, so much so that he oversaw witchcraft trials, that he was there when people were being tortured to get confessions from them. Torture in Scotland mainly was sleep deprivation, interestingly enough. They would just keep people awake for days and constantly question them about witchcraft, and it's hardly surprising after days they're gibbering about them and their friends being involved in covens and stuff like that. Their minds were broken. There was some physical torture as well that did happen. The Privy Council didn't approve of it and tried to stop it. That's from the second wave onward. The first wave, it was just uncontrollable. And that's why we don't have a lot of records of people that were killed as witches, because no good records were kept. And any court could try a woman as a witch or a man as a witch. But James VI wrote the book called Demonology. And that book was basically a guidebook to the demonic forces in the world. And at that time, the belief in the devil being amongst the people of Scotland was absolute. There was no doubt the devil was infiltrating people in Scotland. And the rationale for that, the rationale for it being women that were being infiltrated, was something Zoe and I strongly disagree with, that women were intellectually and morally weaker and therefore would be easy prey for the devil. And because they would be easy prey for the devil, that's the way he would get in through society, and that's the reason that women are witches. So anyway, about 4 different answers to there, but essentially, it was because James the Sixth was obsessed, and he validated and encouraged and promoted and wrote the book and made it seem accessible at all levels of society, that the devil amongst us, there were witches there and they had to be weeded out. And you put all those 3 combinations together, and for almost 200 years in Scotland, there was a legacy where women and men were terrified of being called a witch, mostly women.
Mm-hmm. And we've got another question here from Joan Harron, who has said to us, I'll read out the question: I appreciate the spirit of your project, but I know feminists involved with earth-based spirituality who are happy to claim the name of witch and see it as a positive identity. Have you thought about how your project might impact on women like this? So in answer to that, we have obviously no issue with people, women, it's men too, identifying as witches in the modern day. And that's a distinctly separate thing to what we're talking about. So in the days that we're talking about, where there was the accusations and the executions, the women and the men, really, as Claire's just said, really believed in the devil. Like we're as a very, very religious society, and did not in any way want to be called a witch for the most part. They were absolutely horrified by it. They were all terrified of the devil and of evil and the sort of the nature of that. So that's a very distinct and separate thing to a much more modern interpretation of what it is to be a witch, which we've obviously got no issue with. The 2 of us are very much, do your thing. That's totally cool. We're not witches.
No, although I actually found out that I have some witch type tendencies, despite being myself a skeptic, a humanist. But we had, and again, one of our great podcasts was Lisa Tarbuck.
No, Alice Tarbuck.
Alice Tarbuck.
The DJ. She may be a witch, I don't know, but it was Alice that was on the show.
And Alice wrote, she might be, she wrote, it's A Year in the Wild, and it's a beautiful book going through 12 months of her as a witch. And if you listen to that podcast, and also the first podcast with Julian, where we go into that in some great detail about why some modern day people associate themselves with the history of witchcraft, but why in fact they're 2 completely different things. And in fact, we have a huge number of people who identify as witches in the modern day, supporting what we're doing. There's a huge amount. I think most of the people of that ilk are on Instagram. In fact, we have a huge following of modern day witches on Instagram. So when they hear about the history of it, what we're saying is that nobody should have been killed being accused of witchcraft. I have to make clear, at the time, there were people who were called different things like cunning folk, or there were people that performed charms that were called charmers. That was different from witchcraft. So even then, there was still kind of a body of people who performed folk healing and folk medicine that were in fact different. Witchcraft was a very, very specific thing where you gave up your baptism. You became baptized by the devil, and you were doing the devil's work. You were doing maleficious. You were doing bad things.
And there was often a sort of a sexual undertone to a lot of it as well. It was this kind of this idea that we kind of joke about a bit now with that stereotype, but that the devil would meet up with women in the woods and it'd be kind of sexy, and there'd be music and drinking and dancing and all the rest of it. That was the view of it. It wasn't, when they were accused for being witches, it wasn't like, and you were doing a good thing ministering to people. It wasn't like that.
No. I mean, some people were doing good things. We have at the moment they were doing good things, but not as seen by the church. I'll give an example. It was witchcraft to ask for the help of someone to cast a spell or to give you herbs to help you with the pain of childbirth, because childbirth was God given, and therefore you shouldn't interfere with that by giving you any form of assistance. So on occasion, people were accused of witchcraft because they assisted women in childbirth by giving them pain relief. Now, there are actually very few examples of that in Scotland, but there are. And sometimes, unfortunately, if children were ill and people tried to help ill children, or it was soon after the birth, the people who helped them be born were accused of witchcraft. So currently at the moment, we're on the steering group of the Royal College of Nursing is doing a study. Dr. Nicola Ring and her associates are doing a study in relation to the women who were doing some form of healing that might have been called early nurses or early midwives, and we hope that that's going to be finished in October, and we're going to have the findings of that brought out. So, but thank you very much for that question. It is an important one, but there really is no tension between modern day witches and the story of those who were accused as witchcraft. But thanks for that question. It's a good one.
Yeah, we've actually got an episode we're hoping to do soon about myth busting and about looking at different sort of ideas that we hold that we want to challenge in different ways, or stereotypes that aren't really held up by historical facts. I think that's going to be quite interesting, because the interpretation of what it is to be a witch now, it differs quite a lot to sort of the reality, and it's a much more modern interpretation. But we also did a really interesting podcast where we spoke to an Irish TV program maker, and that's quite an early one. And she talked about how in Ireland it wasn't the same as Scotland. There were nowhere near as many accusations, and it's because that culturally there's a much sort of looser line between sort of the supernatural world potentially, and people living their lives at the sort of the thin places and stuff like that. So that was really interesting. So it's really fascinating, because it really tells you a lot about the culture of your country and about where ideas come from, and it's fascinating.
Yeah. Have we got any more questions?
I don't think so. I think that's it. Does anybody have a final question before we sign off for today? No.
Oh, yes. Nessa McHugh, yes, indeed. Nessa McHugh is one of the people on Dr. Nicola Ring's research. She's one of the people doing it. I've just seen my friend Nessa, Lynn Genevieve, has said that. Why were the accusations of witchcraft so common everywhere? Was it a way of controlling women? It was a way of controlling everybody, I think. But in particular, women were because women were weaker than men morally and spiritually. It was a way of weeding out the devil, but they really believed in it. It wasn't just we're going to control women and this is a way how to do it. It was, we really believe in the devil. The devil is amongst us, and the devil is amongst women. We must weed it out of them. And so, as a matter of fact, it controlled women.
But also, there's quite a lot of evidence that it was quite often women that accused other women of being witches. So it wasn't just a case of men going around saying that. We've got quite a lot of stories about women that accused other women because maybe they were owed money, or they'd fallen out, or there was some sort of an issue.
Or they confessed when they were.
Yeah, or when they were being tortured or sleep deprived, they came up with a list of other names of just women that they knew. So yeah. I think we have to draw it to a close there though, Claire, because there's another event that's just about to start. Thank you so much for listening. Please do have a look at our website, witchesofscotland.com. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. Claire joined TikTok, but I don't think we've done any TikToks. But please do get in touch, because we love to listen to people's ideas and have the chat and everything. So thank you so much for joining us.